Okay. Thank you very much for attending the FlyersRights press conference today on the case that we brought 4 years ago involving the Boeing 737 MAX. This case began really before the last crash of the MAX in 2019. I'd like to give you a little background of where we came from, why we're here today, and perhaps where we're going. My name is Paul Hudson. I'm president of FlyersRights.org, the largest airline passenger group. We're also the designated representative for the general public and passengers on FAA safety advisory committees. Now, personally, I was not aware of the MAX problems until after the first crash. No one else was either, except people at the FAA certainly knew some things, and Boeing knew a lot about how defective their plane was. After the first crash in October of 2019, it was far away in Indonesia. There were no Americans. I was sort of paying attention to it, but then I got a phone call from a frequent traveler on Line Air. That was the airline that went down. And he said, there's a real problem here. I contacted the Boeing representative, who I'm well acquainted with for many years, after seeing what was happening with the fact that the plane obviously had a haywire flight control system that had taken over, caused lots of up and downs, and then crashed, killing everyone into the sea. Brand new plane. And I asked him, well, how come Boeing hasn't grounded this plane? This is the first week in December of 2018. And his answer was, well, it's under investigation with the NTSB, but we can't tell you anything. It's all secret. So I waited a few weeks. Then I heard, well, we're going to have a fix out in January of 19. Never happened. I waited a little longer. I shouldn't have done that. Then what happened in March? The second plane went down. Now we have 346 lives lost. I then met with then Associate Administrator for Safety at the FAA. His name was Ali Barami. And I asked him, why were you not going to release the information on any fix to this system so we know for sure that it's safe the next time it's ungrounded? Meanwhile, the FAA, after the first crash, had said it's safe. Boeing had said it's safe. And even after the second crash, they all said it's safe. It turned out that China, perhaps Canada, and some other countries had grounded it, and then they overruled essentially the FAA and grounded the plane the next day. Well, Ali Barami, he said, well, we've always done it this way. We keep everything secret, and there's no reason I can see to change things. Of course, we disagreed, and we filed what's called a formal Freedom of Information request. That was ignored. Oh, and by the way, there were 70 other organizations and people that also filed Freedom of Information or FOIA requests. They were also ignored. But FlyersRights was the only one that took it to court. And in December of 19, we began this action, which today, this morning, there was an oral argument before the US Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit. Now, the issue is, should the FAA be able to keep secret essentially all the data relating to its decisions on aircraft certification, and more broadly on safety enforcement generally? We think the answer clearly is, particularly when you have a crash, the information should be public or at least released to outside experts so they can evaluate it. But the FAA disagrees. They want to keep everything secret. So in the litigation that began in the district court, we found out that there were approximately 95 documents, 9,500 pages of documents that they used to unground the MAX in November of 20. Virtually none of it was released. And everything was labeled a trade secret or proprietary information. Also, the individuals involved were also kept secret under Personal Privacy Protection Act. This policy, if it's ratified by the appeal court, won't just apply to the MAX, won't just apply to the FAA. It'll apply to all federal agencies. It'll apply to everyone, especially those that have jurisdictions over health and safety. Because under the FAA policy, almost everything can be labeled as proprietary or trade secrets or some other exception. And that will simply collapse the intention of FOIA, which is to make a government agency decisions transparent. Now, we thought we had some progress in this because both Boeing CEO and the then FAA administrator promised Congress, promised the public that everything would be transparent in the ungrounding. But however, when we got to court, it was a different story. They said, well, that didn't really mean what it said. That was just puffery. That had nothing to do with the actual policy to keep any hard data secret. Now, in addition to that, we had about a dozen safety experts who agreed with us, including some stakeholders like the Flight Attendants Union, but it didn't matter. Boeing prevailed at the district court level, and now some of these experts also filed a brief in the current appeal. And this morning, that was argued by our lead counsel, Joseph Sandler, and I'd like to have him come up and say a few words about the legal aspects of the case and where he sees it happening now.
Thanks, Paul. So I think it's safe to say that in spite of the commitment of the current administration to greater openness and transparency and meaningful enforcement of the Freedom of Information Act, the courts have been making it more difficult to use FOIA to find out, in the words of the Supreme Court when it first came out, what the government is up to. In 2019, the Supreme Court decided the Argus Food Marketing Institute versus Argus Leader case, in which they held that if information is normally treated as confidential and proprietary by a business that submits it to a government agency, the presumption is it can be withheld from the public, withheld under in response to a Freedom of Information Act request. So that decision has threatened to make it much more difficult to figure out the basis for agency decisions involving any regulated industry, whether it's airlines, whether it's cars, whether it's whatever it is. And in this case, as Paul explained, the FAA deferred lock, stock, and barrel to Boeing's determination that every piece of paper they submitted, every document they submitted to persuade the agency to unground the 737 MAX was confidential and proprietary and had to be withheld from the public. I think we were encouraged this morning that the panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit expressed skepticism and concern about the FAA's efforts to just throw a complete blanket of secrecy over every document that Boeing had submitted, including the FAA's own comments and responses to Boeing's proposed fixes to the aircraft design, and including the test procedures, the means of compliance that Boeing itself had proposed to demonstrate its compliance with the FAA's own regulations. In fact, when this appeal was first filed, the government urged the Court of Appeals to throw it out without even hearing it, basically summary affirmance of the district court's decision, and the court decided to hear it. I think, we're hopeful that there will be, hopeful, very, cautiously optimistic that there may be some, the court will take on to some extent the wholesale effort to keep everything secret on the part of the FAA. But it'll be necessary, for the lower courts to find ways to limit the damage to the Supreme Court decision to the proper implementation of Freedom of Information Act, and ultimately may be necessary, for Congress to act further if we can't achieve it through the courts. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you,